I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're not on the list. That was the first thing I heard at my husband's funeral. Not condolences. Not a gentle greeting. Just a polite, rehearsed voice stopping me at the entrance like I didn't belong there. I stood still for a moment, my gloved hand resting on the strap of my purse, staring at the young man in the black suit who refused to meet my eyes. Behind him, through the tall glass doors, I could see the room already filled, people dressed in dark colors, soft music playing, flowers arranged exactly the way Edward would have liked. My husband's funeral had already begun. And somehow, I was an outsider. There must be a mistake, I said quietly, keeping my voice even. This is my husband's service. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the tablet in his hands. I understand, ma'am. But the guest list was provided by the family, and your name isn't here. The family. I almost smiled at that. Before I could respond, I heard her voice. Oh, there you are. Rachel stepped forward from inside, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She looked immaculate, of course. Perfect black dress, not a wrinkle in sight, her blonde hair pinned back in a way that made her look composed, almost serene. Anyone watching would think she was the grieving daughter-in-law holding everything together. There's been a little confusion, she said to the attendant with a practiced smile. Then she turned to me, lowering her voice just enough to sound considerate. Margaret, you should have told me you were coming this early. We're still organizing seating. I noticed the way she didn't say my last name. Didn't introduce me properly. Just Margaret. Like I was an afterthought. It's my husband's funeral, I replied. I didn't realize I needed an invitation. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes did something colder. Of course not. We just have a structure in place. You know how these things can get. I did know. I knew exactly what she was doing. Making it look like a misunderstanding. Like I had simply shown up at the wrong time, instead of being deliberately left off. The attendant stepped aside after she gave a small nod, and I walked in without another word. The room fell into that subtle hush people try to hide when something uncomfortable happens. A few heads turned. Some recognized me. Most didn't. I scanned the seating arrangement quickly. The front rows were filled with people I barely knew, business associates, Rachel's relatives, even neighbors I'd only met once or twice. My seat, I discovered, was near the back. Not even with the family. Just another chair, tucked beside a woman who was scrolling through her phone. I sat down slowly, smoothing my coat over my knees, and folded my hands in my lap. No one came to greet me. Not even Daniel. I saw him across the room, standing beside Rachel, nodding as someone spoke to him. My son looked older than I remembered. Tired. But when his eyes briefly passed over me, there was no recognition. Or maybe there was, and he chose to look away. That part, I couldn't quite decide. I listened as conversations drifted around me. Quiet voices. Careful words. But not careful enough. I heard she doesn't have much left, someone whispered behind me. After the medical bills, another voice replied, softer but sharper. Well, Rachel's been handling everything. It's probably for the best. I kept my gaze forward. I didn't turn around. I didn't correct them. Let them think what they wanted. Let them build their little version of me, a widow with nothing, a burden waiting to be managed. On the stage, a large portrait of Edward stood beside the casket. He looked exactly as I remembered him, strong, composed, the kind of man who never raised his voice but was always heard. For 42 years, I had stood beside him. Built a life with him. Watched him create everything they were now quietly dividing in their minds. And yet here I was, sitting at the back of the room like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Rachel took the podium first. Her voice was soft, measured, perfectly emotional without ever losing control. Edward was a man who believed in providing for his family, she said. He made sure everything was taken care of. I noticed the way she said it. Everything. As if she were the one now holding the keys to all of it. As if I had never been part of those decisions. As if I had simply existed on the edges of his life instead of at the center. I felt a few glances drift toward me. Curious. Pitying. Assessing. I gave them nothing in return. No. Tears. No reaction. Just stillness. Because the truth was, they were right about one thing. I hadn't said a word. Not about the accounts. Not about the documents Edward had signed just months before he passed. Not about the number that would change the way every single person in that room looked at me. $28 million. I folded my hands a little tighter, my expression calm, almost serene. Let them have their assumptions. Let them believe I was small. Because by the end of that day, the only thing being buried wouldn't be my husband. The reception room felt colder after the speeches began, even though the temperature had not changed. I remained seated in the same chair near the back, watching the slow choreography of people standing, sitting, nodding at the appropriate moments, as if grief itself had a script everyone else had memorized except me. A woman beside me leaned over slightly and whispered, "Were you close to him?" I turned my head just enough to meet her eyes and gave a small, polite smile. "For 42 years, I said." She blinked, startled, then quickly looked away, her cheeks coloring as she realized who I was. That was how it went for the rest of the afternoon. Recognition came in pieces, always followed by discomfort. No one knew quite what to do with me once they understood. Not important enough to be at the front. Not invisible enough to be ignored completely. I existed somewhere in between, like a detail that had been misplaced and quietly left there. From where I sat, I could see Rachel moving through the crowd with careful precision. She touched arms, nodded sympathetically, accepted condolences as if they belonged to her. Every movement was deliberate. Every expression measured. If someone had walked in late, they would have assumed she had been the center of Edward's world. I watched as she paused near a group of men in dark suits, her voice lowering into that respectful tone reserved for business conversations. Daniel stood beside her, hands clasped in front of him, listening more than speaking. That, at least, had not changed. He had always been quieter, more inclined to follow than to lead. Still, there was something different now. A distance I could not quite measure. He did not look toward me again. Not once. After the formal service ended, people began to rise and drift toward the adjoining room where refreshments had been arranged. I waited until most of them had moved before standing. There was no rush. No one was waiting for me. As I stepped into the reception area, the low hum of conversation wrapped around me immediately. Silver trays, neatly arranged glasses, soft lighting designed to make everything feel warmer than it was. I recognized some of the faces now. Neighbors. Former colleagues of Edward's. A few distant relatives. They spoke in gentle tones, but the words carried. "Rachel has really stepped up," someone said near the buffet table. "It must be overwhelming, managing everything." Another voice responded, "Well, she has always been very capable. And from what I understand, Margaret was never involved in the financial side." I reached for a glass of water, my hand steady. Never involved. That was an interesting version of my life. I had balanced accounts at the kitchen table while Edward worked late. Reviewed contracts with him on Sunday mornings. Sat beside him during meetings where decisions were made that shaped decades. But that was not the story being told now. Now, I was the woman who had simply been there. Present, but not essential. I took a small sip and set the glass back down. Across the room, I noticed a familiar figure entering through the side door. He moved more slowly than the others, his posture straight despite his age, his expression composed in a way that suggested he did not belong to the quiet chaos of the room. Mr. Howard Bennett. Edward's attorney for over 20 years. He paused briefly, scanning the room, and then his eyes found me. There was no hesitation in his recognition. No confusion. He gave a slight nod, respectful, almost formal, and began making his way in my direction. I saw the shift immediately. Rachel noticed him too. Her posture changed, just slightly, but enough. She stepped forward before he could reach me, intercepting him with a practiced smile. "Mr. Bennet," she said warmly, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming. It means so much." He shook her hand, but his attention was elsewhere. "Of course," he replied politely, then added, "I was hoping to speak with Mrs. Collins." Rachel's smile held, but only just. "Margaret has had a long day," she said smoothly. "Perhaps another time would be more appropriate." I did not move. I did not step forward. I simply watched. Mr. Bennet's expression did not change. "I understand," he said, his tone calm, "but this will only take a moment." There was a brief silence. Not loud. Not obvious. But enough for those closest to notice. Rachel glanced toward Daniel, as if expecting him to say something, to support her decision. He shifted his weight slightly, his gaze flickering between them, uncertain. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "It is all right," I said finally, my voice quiet but clear. "I can speak with him." Rachel turned toward me then, her eyes sharper now, the polite mask thinning at the edges. "Margaret, this really is not the time." "It is exactly the time," I replied. Not louder. Not forceful. Just certain. Mr. Bennet stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly as he addressed me. "Mrs. Collins, Edward asked me to ensure that certain matters were handled personally." I felt the room shift again, subtle but undeniable. Conversation slowed. A few heads turned. Curiosity, that quiet, persistent force, began to spread. I nodded once. "Then we should not keep him waiting," I said. And for the first time that day, Rachel did not have an answer ready. Mr. Bennet did not ask me to follow him far, only a few steps away from the center of the room where the conversation softened but did not disappear. Close enough for privacy, yet still within sight of everyone who suddenly found us far more interesting than they had a moment ago. I could feel it without turning my head, the quiet shift in attention, the subtle leaning of bodies, the way voices lowered just enough to listen without appearing obvious. Curiosity had replaced sympathy. "Edward left very specific instructions," Mr. Bennet said, his tone measured, respectful, as if we were seated across from each other in his office rather than standing among catered tables and polite strangers. "He wanted certain matters addressed in person, and only with you present." I nodded once, my hands still folded calmly in front of me. "He always preferred clarity," I replied. That was true. Edward did not leave things unfinished. He did not trust assumptions. And he certainly did not leave important decisions in the hands of people who had not earned them. Behind us, I heard Rachel's voice again, lighter now, attempting to resume control of the room. "Please, everyone, make sure you have something to eat," she said, her tone warm but slightly strained at the edges. Edward would have wanted us to take care of each other today. It was a well-chosen line. Something that sounded generous while keeping attention directed where she wanted it. But it was no longer working the same way. Too many eyes were still drifting toward us. Too many conversations had slowed just enough to listen. Mr. Bennet reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a slim, sealed envelope. It was simple. No markings. No dramatic presentation. Just paper. He held it carefully, not offering it yet, but letting it exist between us as something that required acknowledgement. "He asked that this be given to you directly," he said. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. "And no one else has seen it?" It was not a question. He gave a small, confirming nod. "No one else." I allowed a brief silence to settle. Not for effect, but because I could feel the weight of what Edward had set in motion. He had known. Not every detail, perhaps, but enough. Enough to understand that what appeared calm on the surface was something else underneath. I reached out and took the envelope. My hands did not tremble. I had already lived through the hardest part. What remained now was simply truth, and truth had never frightened me. Before I could open it, Rachel's voice cut through again, closer this time. "Margaret," she said, her tone still polite, but firmer now. "I really think anything legal can wait until tomorrow. Today is about honoring Edward." I turned my head slightly to look at her. She was standing just a few feet away, Daniel beside her, his expression uncertain, his posture tight. She had positioned herself carefully, not interrupting, but not allowing distance either. Always close enough to influence. Always ready to step in. "This is about honoring him," I said. My voice remained calm, steady, almost gentle. That seemed to unsettle her more than anything else would have. For a brief moment, her expression shifted. Not dramatically. Just a flicker. A calculation adjusting itself. "Of course," she replied, smoothing it over quickly. "I only meant that it might be overwhelming right now." Overwhelming. That word again. As if I were fragile. As if I needed to be managed. I looked back at the envelope in my hands. Then, without any sense of urgency, I broke the seal. The paper inside was folded once, precise, deliberate. Edward's way. I unfolded it slowly, aware that the room had grown quieter again, though no one would admit it. I read the first line, and something inside me settled completely. Not surprise. Not shock. Just recognition. Of him. Of the way he thought. Of the way he planned. Mr. Bennet spoke again, quietly, so that only I could hear. "There are additional documents," he said. "But he wanted you to read that first." I nodded, my eyes still on the page. Behind me, I could sense Rachel's attention sharpening, her patience thinning. Daniel shifted again, as if he wanted to ask something but did not know how. I folded the paper carefully, just as it had been, and held it for a moment longer before lowering my hands. Then I lifted my gaze, not to Rachel, not to Daniel, but to the room itself. To the people who had already decided who I was. To the quiet assumptions that had settled like dust over everything Edward had built. "Mr. Bennet," I said, my voice clear enough to carry just a little further than before, "I believe it is time we continue this properly." He inclined his head slightly. "Whenever you are ready, Mrs. Collins." I allowed myself a small, composed smile. Not for them. Not for Rachel. But for Edward. Because in that moment, I understood exactly what he had done. And more importantly, I understood what they had not yet realized. This was never going to unfold the way they expected. I did not raise my voice, and I did not move quickly. That was the part they never understood about me. Strength does not need volume, and certainty does not rush. I simply turned slightly toward Mr. Bennet, giving him my full attention, as if the rest of the room had already faded into something distant and unimportant. "We should proceed," I said again, this time quieter, but firmer. He gave a small nod, then reached into his briefcase, which I had not even noticed him carrying before. From it, he withdrew a thin leather folder, worn just enough to suggest it had been handled carefully over time. Not new. Not improvised. Prepared. That detail alone told me everything I needed to know about Edward's intentions. This was not something decided in his final days. This had been planned. Deliberately. Patiently. Edward updated several documents over the past year, Mr. Bennet said, his tone still measured, still respectful. He was very clear about the conditions under which they would be presented. I heard Rachel take a step closer behind me. Not enough to interrupt, but enough to assert presence. "Margaret," she said, her voice softer now, almost persuasive, "whatever this is, we can handle it together. There is no need to make a scene." A scene. I almost admired the choice of words. As if I were the one creating discomfort. As if everything that had happened before this moment had been invisible. I did not turn to face her. "There is no scene," I replied calmly. "Only clarity. Mr. Bennet opened the folder slowly, revealing several neatly organized documents. He did not hand them over immediately. Instead, he spoke first, ensuring that every word landed exactly where it needed to. Edward established a separate financial structure, he said. Independent accounts, assets, and protections that were not disclosed in the primary estate overview. I could feel it then. The shift. Not loud. Not obvious. But unmistakable. Conversations nearby faltered. A glass paused halfway to someone's lips. Even those who could not hear the exact words sensed that something had changed. Rachel's silence behind me was no longer controlled. It was searching. Calculating. "I am not sure I understand," she said carefully. Mr. Bennet did not look at her. "These arrangements were made specifically to ensure that Mrs. Collins would have complete autonomy over certain holdings," he continued. "Holdings that are not subject to distribution under the standard terms." I reached out and took the first document he offered. The paper was heavier than usual, the print precise, the signatures unmistakable. Edward's name. Dated. Witnessed. Final. I did not need to read every line to understand the structure. I had helped build it. Piece by piece, decision by decision, over decades. What I was seeing now was simply the final layer. The one no one else had been allowed to see. "This includes liquid assets, investment portfolios, and property interests," Mr. Bennet added. His voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it now. Not emotion. Not judgment. Just quiet authority. "The total valuation exceeds $28 million. The number did not echo loudly. It did not need to. It settled into the room like something heavier than sound. Rachel did not speak immediately. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a small, almost imperceptible inhale. Daniel moved first. That cannot be right," he said, his voice uncertain, his words slower than usual, as if they had to find their way out. I turned slightly then, just enough to look at him. Not with anger. Not with disappointment. Just with recognition. Of the distance between us. Of the choices that had led to this moment. "It is right," I said. Rachel stepped forward now, no longer maintaining the careful distance she had held before. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, her composure tightening. "Edward would have told us. We have been managing everything." Managing. The word lingered for a moment. I folded the document carefully and handed it back to Mr. Bennet. "You have been managing what you were allowed to see," I replied. My voice did not change. It did not need to. That was when the room truly shifted. Not just curiosity now. Not just attention. Something else. Something sharper. People were no longer pretending not to listen. The distance between conversations narrowed. I settled more openly. The polite barrier had cracked. Mr. Bennet continued, as if this were all unfolding exactly as expected. "There are also conditions," he said. "Specific provisions regarding conduct and entitlement." Rachel's expression changed again, this time more noticeably. Not panic. Not yet. But something close to it. "Conditions?" she repeated. I did not look at her. I did not need to. I could feel the tension in the space between us. The careful structure she had built throughout the day was beginning to shift under her feet. And for the first time since I had arrived, I allowed myself to feel something beyond stillness. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Just certainty. Because Edward had not only prepared for this moment. He had understood it. Completely. And now, so did I. The word lingered in the air longer than anything else that had been said that afternoon. Conditions. It was not a complicated word, but in that moment it carried weight, the kind that could not be dismissed with a polite smile or redirected with a carefully chosen phrase. Rachel did not move immediately, but I could. Feel her attention sharpen, her mind racing ahead, trying to calculate outcomes before the full picture had even been revealed. Daniel stood beside her, quieter now, his uncertainty no longer hidden behind silence but visible in the way his shoulders had stiffened, the way his gaze shifted between Mr. Bennet and me as if searching for something familiar to hold on to. "What kind of conditions?" Rachel asked finally, her voice steady but tighter than before. Mr. Bennet did not answer her directly. He turned a page in the folder, his movements unhurried, precise, as though time itself had slowed to match the importance of what he was about to say. Edward included a conduct clause, he explained. A provision designed to ensure that any individual who demonstrated disregard, disrespect, or exclusion toward Mrs. Collins would forfeit any claim to associated benefits within the estate. There was a pause. Not long. But long enough for the meaning to settle. Not everyone in the room understood the legal language, but they understood tone. They understood implication. And most of all, they understood that something had just shifted in a way that could not be undone. Rachel let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without warmth. "That seems subjective," she said. "How would something like that even be determined?" Mr. Bennet closed the folder halfway, his gaze calm, unwavering. "Edward was very specific," he replied. "Documentation, witness accounts, and observed conduct are all considered. Including events that occur in public settings." Public settings. The words did not need emphasis. The room itself provided that. I could feel it now, the subtle awareness spreading through the guests. Conversations had not stopped entirely, but they had changed. Lower. Slower. More careful. People were no longer simply observing. They were remembering. Replaying moments from earlier that day. The entrance. The seating. The introductions. The absence of acknowledgement. Small things, perhaps. But no longer insignificant. Daniel shifted again, this time stepping slightly forward. "This does not make sense," he said, his voice uncertain but more insistent now. "Why would he set something like that up?" I looked at him then, fully this time. Not as a stranger across the room, but as my son. The boy who had once held my hand without hesitation. The man who now stood in front of me, unsure of where he belonged. "Because he paid attention," I said simply. There was no accusation in my tone. No bitterness. Just truth. Rachel's composure tightened further. "This is being taken out of context," she said quickly, her words coming faster now. "Edward trusted us. He knew we were handling everything responsibly." I did not respond immediately. I allowed the silence to stretch, just slightly, just enough to let her words exist on their own. Then I spoke. "Trust does not require control," I said. Mr. Bennet reopened the folder and withdrew another document, this one marked with a small tab. "There is also a timeline attached to the clause," he added. "Recent behavior carries significant weight in the evaluation." Rachel's expression shifted again, this time more noticeably. Not panic. Not yet. But the edge of it. The first crack in something that had been carefully maintained. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. Mr. Bennet did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I am not suggesting anything," he said. "I am explaining what has already been established." The distinction mattered. Suggestion implied uncertainty. This was not uncertain. This was already decided. I could feel the room holding its breath now, not literally, but in that quiet way people do when they realize they are witnessing something that will be talked about long after it is over. Not loudly. Not directly. But remembered. Retold. Reinterpreted. I folded my hands again, just as I had when I first sat down, the gesture familiar, grounding. "You believed I had nothing," I said, my voice calm, almost reflective. I was not speaking only to Rachel. Or to Daniel. I was speaking to the room. To the assumptions that had shaped the entire day. You believed I would simply accept whatever decisions were made for me. No one interrupted. No one corrected me. Because there was nothing to correct. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she did not have a response ready. Daniel looked down briefly, then back up, as if trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he thought he knew. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, more to myself than to anyone else. Edward understood something that I chose not to say, I continued. He understood that silence is not the same as weakness. The words settled into the space between us, quiet but undeniable. Mr. Bennet closed the folder once more. This time completely, as if marking the end of explanation and the beginning of consequence. And in that moment, I knew that nothing in that room would return to the way it had been before. No one moved to fill the silence after that. It lingered, stretching across the room in a way that made every small sound feel louder than it should have been. The faint clink of glass. The soft shuffle of shoes against polished floors. Even breathing seemed more noticeable now, as if the entire room had become aware of itself. I remained exactly where I was, my posture unchanged, my hands still loosely folded. I had spent years learning how to sit in silence without needing to break it, how to let others reveal themselves simply by giving them space. It was a skill that had served me well in quieter moments. Today, it was serving me even better. Rachel was the first to move. Not forward, not backward, but slightly to the side, as if adjusting her position could somehow restore balance to something that had already shifted beyond her control. I think we are overcomplicating this, she said, her tone lighter again, though the effort behind it was now visible. Today is not about finances or legal technicalities. It is about remembering Edward. Her words were carefully chosen, but they landed differently now. Before, they might have guided the room. Now, they felt like an attempt to redirect something that no longer wanted to be redirected. Mr. Bennet did not respond. He simply waited, his presence steady, his silence more effective than any interruption could have been. Daniel glanced between us again, his uncertainty deepening into something closer to discomfort. Maybe we should talk about this privately, he suggested, his voice quieter than before. Private. That word might have worked earlier. Before the room had become aware. Before the shift had taken hold. I turned my head slightly toward him. You had no interest in privacy when decisions were being made without me, I said. My tone was not harsh. It did not need to be. Truth, when spoken calmly, has a way of settling deeper than anger ever could. Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped. The hesitation was familiar. It reminded me of moments from years ago, when he would search for the right words and find none. But he was not a child anymore, and this was not a moment that could be softened by silence. Rachel stepped in before he could try again. That is not fair, she said, her voice firmer now. We have been doing everything we can to manage things responsibly. You have not been involved. There it was again. The narrative. The version of events that had been quietly constructed over time. I looked at her fully now, meeting her gaze without resistance, without emotion, just clarity. You assumed I was not involved, I replied. The distinction mattered. It always had. She held my gaze for a moment longer than before, as if trying to find something in my expression that would confirm her position, something that would allow her to regain footing. But there was nothing there for her to use. No defensiveness. No uncertainty. Only stillness. Mr. Bennet spoke again, his voice calm, cutting gently through the tension. The evaluation process does not require immediate resolution, he said. However, it is important to understand that behavior observed today will be formally documented. Documented. The word settled heavily. Not dramatic. Not loud. But final in a way that could not be undone. I noticed the reactions then, subtle but unmistakable. A woman near the buffet table lowered her gaze, suddenly very interested in the arrangement of flowers beside her. A man who had been speaking moments ago fell silent, his expression shifting as if reconsidering something he had already said. Even those who had not been directly involved understood what documentation meant. It meant permanence. It meant that moments like these were no longer fleeting. Rachel exhaled slowly, the control she had maintained beginning to slip at the edges. "So what exactly are you saying?" she asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Mr. Bennet did not hesitate. "I am saying that the conditions Edward established are active," he replied. "And that they are being applied." There was no emphasis. No need for it. The simplicity of the statement was enough. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that felt out of place in the otherwise composed setting. "This is not how this was supposed to go," he said quietly, almost to himself. I heard him. I understood what he meant. This was not the version of the day he had expected. Not the version where everything moved smoothly, where roles were clearly defined, where I remained in the background, quiet and compliant. But expectations are not reality. They are only reflections of what someone hopes will happen. "No," I said softly, though my voice carried just enough to reach him. "It is not." I did not elaborate. I did not need to. Because in that moment, the difference between what they had planned and what was unfolding stood clearly in front of all of us. And for the first time since I had walked through those doors, I could see it reflected not just in their expressions, but in the room itself. The balance had shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But completely. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not. Something invisible had shifted too far beneath the surface, and no amount of polite conversation or careful smiles could put it back where it had been. I could see it in the way people held themselves now, slightly more rigid, slightly more aware, as if they had all realized at the same time that they were no longer just attendees at a funeral, but witnesses to something else entirely. Rachel tried again, because she had always been someone who did not stop at the first sign of resistance. "We need to be reasonable," she said, her voice measured, but now carrying an edge that had not been there before. "This is not just about one moment. You cannot take a single day and use it to determine something this significant." Mr. Bennet did not respond immediately. He allowed her words to settle, to exist fully in the space, before speaking. "It is not one moment," he said. "It is a pattern." The word landed with quiet precision. Pattern. Not accusation. Not interpretation. Something observable. Something that could be traced. Rachel's posture stiffened, her control tightening into something sharper. "That is your interpretation," she replied. "And I do not agree with it." I watched her carefully now, not with judgment, but with clarity. For years, I had seen the smaller versions of this. The subtle shifts. The careful redirections. The way decisions were framed as necessities rather than choices. It had always been quiet enough to ignore, easy enough to explain away. Until it was not. "Agreement is not required," Mr. Bennet said calmly. That was the moment the room changed again. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they meant. There was no negotiation in them. No space for reinterpretation. Just a line that had already been drawn. Daniel took a step forward, closer than he had been all afternoon. "There has to be some kind of process," he said, his voice more urgent now. "Something we can do to clarify all of this." I turned toward him slightly, not fully, just enough to meet him halfway. "There is a process," I said. "You are in it." He frowned, the confusion in his expression deepening. For a moment, I saw something familiar there. Not the man he had become, but the boy he had been. The one who had always believed things could be explained if he just asked the right question. But this was not that kind of moment. Rachel exhaled sharply, the first clear sign that her composure was no longer holding the way it had before. "This is not how families handle things," she said. "We talk. We make decisions together. Together." The word hung between us, hollow in a way that needed no explanation. I did not raise my voice. I did not step closer. I simply let the silence answer for me. Because we both knew what together had meant these past few years. Decisions made in rooms I was not invited into. Conversations that happened after I had left. Plans that were presented to me as conclusions rather than discussions. Mr. Bennet closed his briefcase slowly, the sound of the latch clicking into place far louder than it should have been in the quiet room. "The next steps will be outlined formally," he said. "Until then, I would advise caution in any assumptions regarding entitlement." Entitlement. Another word that did not need explanation. I could feel the weight of it settling into the room, reshaping the way people stood, the way they looked at one another. Rachel did not speak immediately. She was thinking now, recalculating, searching for a way to regain ground that had already shifted beneath her feet. Daniel looked at me again, longer this time. Not avoiding. Not deflecting. Just looking. As if seeing me for the first time in a way he had not allowed himself to before. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked quietly. The question was simple. Honest, in its own way. I held his gaze for a moment, then answered just as simply. "Because I did not need to." He did not respond. Not right away. And in that silence, I saw something begin to change. Not fully. Not completely. But enough. Enough to recognize that the version of me he had been working with no longer existed. Around us, the room had grown still again, but not in the same way as before. This was not the stillness of uncertainty. It was the stillness of understanding. Of realization settling into place. I adjusted my coat slightly, a small, ordinary movement that felt grounding in a moment that had become anything but ordinary. Then I looked past them, toward the door I had entered through earlier that day. The same door. The same space. But nothing about it felt the same anymore. Because the moment they had tried to reduce me to something smaller, something manageable, something they could define without my consent, was the moment they lost the ability to control what came next. And now, for the first time, they were beginning to understand that. No one tried to stop me when I took a step forward. That was the first thing I noticed. Earlier, there had always been something in the way, a subtle barrier, a quiet redirection, a hand extended just enough to guide me somewhere else. Now there was nothing. Just space. I moved past Rachel without brushing against her, without acknowledging the tension that had settled around her like something visible. She did not reach for me. She did not speak. And that silence told me more than anything she could have said. Mr. Bennet walked beside me, not leading, not following, simply present. The room seemed to shift with us as we moved, conversations dissolving into fragments, eyes following without pretending otherwise anymore. There was no need for politeness now. The moment had already crossed that threshold. I stopped near the front of the room, not at the podium, but close enough that the distance between where I had been seated and where I stood now felt intentional. Measured. Visible. I turned, slowly, allowing myself to face the room fully for the first time that day. Not as someone being observed, but as someone who understood exactly what they were seeing. "Edward believed in structure," I said. My voice was not raised, but it carried. Not because I forced it to, but because the room had already decided to listen. He believed in accountability. I paused, not for effect, but because I could feel the weight of the moment settling into place. And he believed that character reveals itself in the smallest decisions. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Mr. Bennet opened the folder again, standing just slightly to my side. Not speaking. Not directing. Just allowing the documents to exist as confirmation of something that no longer needed explanation. I glanced at the familiar pages, then back at the room. "There are assets that were never discussed publicly," I continued. "Not because they were hidden. But because they were protected." The word lingered. Protected. Not from outsiders. From assumptions. From entitlement. From people who believed access was the same as ownership. I saw Rachel then, just beyond the first row. She was no longer trying to manage the room. No longer guiding conversations or offering careful reassurances. She was watching me now, completely focused, her expression no longer composed but controlled in a different way. Tighter. More deliberate. Those assets, I said, my voice steady, are not part of any distribution that can be influenced by preference or convenience. Daniel stepped forward slightly, as if pulled by something he did not fully understand. What does that mean? He asked. His voice was not confrontational. Just uncertain. I met his gaze briefly, then answered without hesitation. It means they were never yours to manage. The words were simple. Direct. And for the first time, there was no space left for interpretation. The room reacted, not loudly, but visibly. A shift in posture. A quiet intake of breath. The kind of response that happens when something becomes undeniable. Mr. Bennet spoke then, his voice calm, reinforcing what had already been set in motion. The protected holdings remain entirely under Mrs. Collins' authority, he said. With no obligation to allocate, distribute, or disclose beyond what has already been presented. Rachel took a step forward, unable to remain still any longer. This is not reasonable, she said, her voice controlled but no longer smooth. You cannot expect us to simply accept this without discussion. I looked at her then, fully, for the first time since the conversation had begun. Not with anger. Not with accusation. Just with clarity. You already did, I replied. She blinked, just once, the meaning landing before she could stop it. Because this had never been a negotiation. Not today. Not yesterday. Not at any point when decisions had been made without me. Daniel looked between us, his expression shifting again, something deeper now, something closer to realization than confusion. So what happens now? He asked quietly. I let the question settle for a moment. Not because I needed time to answer, but because the answer had already been unfolding around us. Now, I said, things return to where they were always meant to be. I did not elaborate. I did not need to. Because the structure Edward had built was already in place. The conditions had already been set. And the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were present. Visible. Real. I turned slightly, my attention returning to Mr. Bennet, signaling that there was nothing more to explain. He closed the folder once again, the sound quiet but final. Around us, the room did not resume its previous rhythm. It could not. Because what had been revealed was not just information. It was a shift in understanding. A correction of something that had been assumed for far too long. And in that moment, standing where I had once been overlooked, I understood something even more clearly than before. They had not just underestimated me. They had misunderstood everything. I did not stay where I was standing for long. There was nothing left to prove in that spot, nothing left to explain, nothing left to defend. The room had already absorbed what it needed to, and anything more would only dilute what had been made clear. So I turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with the same calm intention that had carried me through the entire day. Mr. Bennet stepped slightly aside to give me space, his presence still steady, still respectful, but no longer necessary in the same way. The documents had done their work. The structure had revealed itself. What remained now was choice. Mine. I began to walk toward the exit, the same path I had taken when I first arrived, though it felt entirely different now. The distance was the same. The floor beneath my feet had not changed. But the weight I carried had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. Behind me, no one called out immediately. No one rushed forward. The silence followed me instead. Stretching across the room like something that could not decide whether to hold me back or let me go. I heard Daniel's voice just before I reached the door. Mom. It was quiet. Not commanding. Not demanding. Just a single word, spoken with a hesitation I had not heard from him in years. I paused, but I did not turn right away. Some things require a moment to settle before they can be faced. When I did turn, it was only halfway, enough to see him without fully stepping back into the room I had already left. He had moved closer now, standing a few feet behind where I had been. Not beside Rachel. Not in front of her. Just there, on his own, as if unsure where he was meant to stand. "I did not know," he said. His voice was low, almost careful, as if each word needed permission to exist. I studied his expression for a moment. Not searching for an excuse. Not looking for justification. Just seeing him as he was, without the distance that had defined us for so long. "You did not ask," I replied. There was no sharpness in the words. No accusation. Just truth, stated simply, the way Edward had always preferred. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up. For a moment, it seemed like he might say more. That he might try to fill the space that had opened between us. But he did not. And that, too, was an answer. Rachel remained where she was, her posture still, her expression controlled, but no longer composed in the way it had been earlier. She did not speak. Not this time. Not when it might have mattered. I held Daniel's gaze for one more second, then gave a small nod. Not forgiveness. Not rejection. Just acknowledgement. Of what had been said. Of what had not. Then I turned back toward the door and continued walking. The attendant who had stopped me earlier stood to the side now, his posture straighter, his expression more careful. He opened the door without needing to be asked. I stepped through without hesitation. The air outside was cooler, quieter, untouched by the tension that had filled the room behind me. For a moment, I stood there, allowing the stillness to settle around me. No voices. No expectations. Just space. Mr. Bennet joined me a moment later, stopping at a respectful distance. "Everything is in place," he said. I nodded once. "I know." He hesitated briefly, then added, "If you need anything further, you know how to reach me." I turned slightly toward him, offering a small, composed smile. "Thank you, Howard." There was nothing more to say. He understood that. After a brief nod, he stepped away, leaving me alone with the quiet. I looked out across the parking lot, the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the pavement. Cars lined in careful rows. People moving in the distance, unaware of what had just unfolded inside. Life continuing, as it always does, regardless of the moments that feel like they should stop everything. I took a slow breath, not out of relief, but out of recognition. Of what had ended. And of what had not. Because despite everything that had been revealed, everything that had shifted, one thing remained unchanged. I had never needed to prove my worth to anyone in that room. Not then. Not now. And certainly not after today. I adjusted my coat slightly, then began walking toward my car, my steps steady, unhurried, exactly as they had been when I first arrived. Only this time, there was no one left to question where I belonged. Because the answer had never been in that room to begin with.